All right, got a budget build here, and yes, I had to go with an Intel processor. I'll explain that in a minute. Let me just grab the receipt for this. This is for someone that's a really basic user, so keep that in mind. This is a really just basic build. And these prices are Canadian. This was in Canada. If you're watching this and you're thinking, I can get that cheaper, probably not. This is pretty good prices here. So let's see. I guess we'll start with the CPU. Typically, I prefer AMD just for personal reasons, but I'm not like a blind fanboy. If someone's a blind fanboy, they would say, "Oh, AMD makes the best gaming processors," and I'd be like, 12th gen, not really." Or they would say if they're an Intel fanboy, they say, "Oh, AMD runs hotter." Not really anymore. They're both great options. Sometimes one's better for other reasons, but I would have liked to have gone with a Ryzen APU, something like the 3200G or 3400G, a quad-core processor with decent built-in graphics. Again, this is for a basic user, and a quad-core would have been fine, but AMD doesn't make those anymore, and the prices on them has skyrocketed to the point that you might as well just go with their 5600G, which is the cheapest APU that AMD makes right now. So the Ryzen 5600G, 6 cores, 12 threads, is about $280 Canadian. I got this guy for 180, I think it was $184.97. So basically $100 less than the price of a 5600G. I got this Core i5-10500. This is also 6 cores, 12 threads. It's going to have the integrated Intel graphics in it, which obviously aren't quite as fast as the Ryzen, the Radeon graphics that would be built into a Ryzen. But again, this isn't for gaming. This would be really basic use. Again, a quad core would have been fine, and this is a 6 core. I would have even went with a Core i3 if the price was right, and I could find one in stock. But I figured, I was going to spend probably about $150 on a Core i3. I might as well just get the Core i5 for, again, it was like $185. We got a 6-core processor. Motherboard was $115. Nothing special. It's a Gigabyte, but it is a B560M. So it's the newer chipset for a 10th gen. This will support a 10th or an 11th generation Intel processor. Obviously, this 10500, that's a 10th generation processor. It's got 4 slots for RAM, a couple M.2 slots, 6 USB ports on the back, 6 ones to Type-C. And again, for built-in video, this has got a DisplayPort, an HDMI, and a DVI. So kind of a good mix if this is going to someone that has maybe an older monitor and you're not sure what connections their monitor is going to have. You've got a good mix of everything there. Again, just a basic board, but at least it has 4 slots for RAM. It's not like a base. It's not as cheap as you can go on motherboards. Again, that was $115, $114.99. The RAM is 16 gigabytes, 3200 megahertz. It's T-Force Vulkan. Not too picky. Intels aren't too picky with RAM. So honestly, RAM's RAM. It's gonna work. That was $72.80 for 16 gigabytes. Again, basic use. I considered going with 8. A quad core with 8 gigs of RAM. But we will be using integrated graphics, so it's going to steal a little bit. And again, the price of that was so cheap, I just figured we'll go with 16. We can set the iGPU to use like the full 2 gigabytes and not worry about if you had 8 gigabytes of RAM and it was, it would leave you with 6. SSD, pretty basic, Western Digital Blue. This is the SN570, which is the newer ones in the blue series. It is an NVMe, and it is 3,500 megabytes per second, and 5-year warranty. So this is a basic model for Western Digital, I guess, compared to like the black would be like the SN750 or SN750 SE. But honestly, at 3,500 megabytes per second, it's really not that much slower. And that was $62.99. The power supply is hilariously overkill. I seriously just wanted to get like a 450 watt power supply. But this guy was on sale. It was $60 instant rebate. So this guy was on sale for $59.99. And on top of that, it had a $10 coupon code, which would have taken another additional $10 off of that. But I'm an idiot and I forgot to use the coupon code. But either way, at $59.99, this is actually cheaper than the CX450M, which was $64.99. And it was cheaper than the CX550M, which I think was $79.99. So like it's ridiculous. The CX650M, again, 650 watts, is way overkill for this system. But when it's on sale and it's cheaper than the CX550M and the CX450M, it almost feels weird to use it. It's so overkill, but again, the price was just right. Case is a Deepcool Matrexx 30. The case was $32.95. You really can't get a case cheaper than that. It's micro ATX. It is tempered glass. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's everything here. So $59.99 for the power supply, $32.95 for the case, $114.99 for the motherboard, $62.99 for the SSD, $72.80 for the RAM, and $184.97 for the Core i5 processor. And I also got some other stuff on this receipt. I bought a keyboard and a mouse, so it's like $20 or something. But yeah, super basic build. In a few ways, it's kind of overkill. Again, for this is going to be very, very basic use. Again, a Core i3 would have been fine. A Ryzen 3 3200G, 3400G would have been fine. But we got a 6-core for not that much more money. 16 gigs of RAM. Again, I considered 8. I think 8 would have been fine. But really, for the price of that, it wasn't much more just to go to 16. And 650 watt power supply, super overkill. Yeah, I haven't done an Intel build in a few years, but I have done a lot of Intel builds in the past. So I'm definitely not new to LGA. And so yeah, let's get this thing put together. I did forget to mention, everything here is brand new. Everything is sealed. The RAM is sealed. The power supply is obviously sealed. Everything here is brand new except for the processor. The processor was an open box return. So that was normally like $199. That's why I got it for $185. I'm sure it's fine. Someone would have bought it and returned it within the 15-day return policy. But they did use the thermal paste up, and so there's no thermal paste pre-applied on the heatsink, so I will need to use thermal paste on there. Alrighty, so I'm just going to get the motherboard out of here. Again, the motherboard was brand new. It actually was taped there. But I opened it just to check the pins already, just to make sure that there was no mangled pins before I took the motherboard home. So yeah, brand new motherboard. Again, nothing fancy. That's a Gigabyte B560M DS3HV2. Part of their ultra durable series, which honestly doesn't mean anything. The UD series is basically the Gigabyte's lower end as far as I know. Obviously, this isn't an Aorus board or a gaming motherboard, whatever that means to you. It does have 4 slots for RAM, as mentioned. It's got 6 SATA ports. 4 of them are facing straight up. 2 of them are like right angled. We got the USB 3.0 or 3.1 Gen 1 header, but no 3.1 Gen 2 header. That's fine. Obviously, on a budget build, the case doesn't even have a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port on the front of it, so it's pretty much irrelevant. Again, 2 M.2 slots. We'll just be using one of those. Probably never use the second one. All right, installing the CPU. So again, this was opened. This was the only thing here that wasn't technically brand new. So there's the processor there. It looks really clean. And this is the stock heatsink, and the thermal paste has been used on that. Alrighty, so I'm going to open this guy up. CPU out. Just make sure there's no thermal paste on the pads. It's basically clean as a whistle. What I do is I look for the 2 little notches on the PCB or substrate, whatever you want to call it. And then I basically line that up on the socket. So there's like 2 little notches here, 2 little notches here. This is probably the easiest thing that someone can screw up when they're new to builds, but that's basically just going to drop into place. What I do is I leave this little plastic cover on while I'm putting the CPU in, and then just clamp her down. And this will pop off on its own. Hang on to that. If you ever have to send the motherboard back to the manufacturer for like an RMA, they usually want to have that on there. So just hang on to that, throw it in the box with the rest of the stuff the motherboard comes with. And now I need to put thermal paste on here because, again, there's none on here, but usually it would be pre-applied on here, and you would just stick this on. But I've got to use some. This is Arctic Silver 5. Hopefully it's not too old. I've had this for a long time. I'm just going to do something like that. I don't even bother spreading it out. Just put the heatsink on and it'll flatten. Now I like to pay attention to where this comes out in relationship to where the header is on the motherboard. So the CPU fan header is right here. And so I'm going to do that like that. Yeah, so I'm going to do that like that. Now these little plastic push pins are kind of crap, but Intel's been using these for well, since socket 775, so Pentium 4, late Pentium 4 era, early Core 2 Duo, and yeah, they haven't changed. But yeah, they just push in and they kind of snap. Really weird, but basically all it's doing is pushing a little plastic post through, and it spreads out the 2 little white bits. And they spread out in the holes. It's just poking through the holes on the board. It's not the greatest design, but they've been using it for a decade, more than a decade now, and I guess it works. The reason I like to have the cable coming off so close to that is so I can just tie it up nice and tight and have that as close as it can be and try and keep all this extra cable nice and clean. But yeah. You'll notice I've just got the motherboard sitting on the motherboard box, and that's usually how I do a CPU install, especially on a brand new build, and the RAM. Now for the RAM, we've got 4 slots on the motherboard, and we've got 2 sticks of RAM. You'll notice these are color-coded, like black, gray, We're actually going to use the 2 gray ones. It's basically staggered. So this is basically channel A, slot 1 for channel A, and then this is slot 1 for channel B. So this just ensures that we're going to be running the memory in dual channel mode and getting the bandwidth benefits of having 2 matching pairs of 2 matching sticks of RAM. So you usually want your RAM matched in pairs, so it'll run in dual channel mode, which is just a small performance boost. So yeah, just make sure you're putting the RAM in the right slots. It's probably going to work regardless, but if you put them in the wrong slots, it's going to run in single channel mode instead of dual channel mode, and you're going to lose a little bit of performance. All right, to install the M.2 drive, we are going to need a small Phillips screwdriver. So this is your M.2 slot. Well, there's actually 2 of them, but typically for your first M.2, you want to install it in the closest slot to the CPU.
Yo, yeah, just gonna interrupt here for a minute. It's me from the future editing this video. I just wanted to point out 99.9% of the time you do want to put your only M.2 drive in the closest slot to the CPU. That's because the CPU has its own PCI Express lanes, and those are directly connected to that M.2 slot. So that M.2 slot usually runs the fastest. Typically, you just get used to that you want to put your M.2, if it's the only M.2, in the slot closest to the CPU. Well, here it actually turned out that we want it in the other slot. This is something very specific with the B560 chipset-based motherboard, and the fact we're using a 10th generation processor on it, not an 11th generation processor. So your processor has your PCI Express controller in it. So not only does the motherboard have to support, say, for example, PCI Express 4.0, which the 500 series chipset here does, the CPU also has to support it. So a 10th generation CPU does not support PCI Express 4.0, an 11th generation would. Now, I knew this going in. That's not a big deal. My M.2 drive's not even PCI Express 4.0. It doesn't really matter. And typically, if your M.2 slot can't run at PCI Express 4.0, you would expect, it would just run at 3.0 instead. But, this is a rare circumstance where the M.2 slot just doesn't work at all. And it's not just a Gigabyte specific issue. This is the B560 chipset, Intel chipset with an Intel 10th generation processor. If we were using an 11th generation processor, that M.2 slot would work. Using a 10th, it doesn't. I actually found a Asus B560 motherboard just to show you on the back of the box. On this one, it's actually very clear that this M.2 slot will not work if you're using a 10th generation processor. And I'm actually giving props to Asus here for making that clear on the box. The back of the Gigabyte box that I'm using, it's not that clear. It just says, it says certain features may not work with using a 10th generation processor. And to someone who knows enough to be dangerous, they're going to assume that they're just saying PCI Express 4.0 won't work. But it'll still work at, as PCI Express 3.0. They're not being very clear, and I think they should be clear on that on the back of the box. So props to Asus for being clear about it, but it's not an Asus issue or a Gigabyte issue specifically. It's if you're using a motherboard with an Intel B560 chipset and a 10th generation processor, your one M.2 slot closest to the CPU will not work. So there's a very strange circumstance. And again, I've built hundreds of Intel systems in the past, and lots of AMD Ryzen systems in the present. And this has never been an issue before where an M.2 slot didn't work, especially the one closest to the CPU, which is normally the one you want to use. Just in this circumstance, I did have to switch it over to the other M.2 slot.
An M.2 stick kind of installs like a SODIMM like RAM on a laptop. Kind of just pushes into the slot and on an angle where it's going to kind of want to stay. And you push it down. Going to be a little standoff on the motherboard, and that standoff is already in the right spot for this length. This is I think that's an 80 millimeter. Typical SSD length is like 80 millimeters, I believe. It's in a little bag, so yeah, don't lose this. A little screw to install the M.2 drive. Is this screwdriver magnetic? Kind of. All right. That's it. The little screw just holds the M.2 drive down. So now we've got the CPU, the RAM, and the SSD all installed on the motherboard. I can start putting it in the case now. Alrighty. So this is my first look at this case. Well, not my first time seeing the case, but my first time building a computer in this case. Again, this is a Deepcool GAMX 30, and it was like 35 bucks or something. Super cheap case. I always take both side panels off. You're going to need to get into the back. And it also means you can lay the computer down and not worry about scratching up this side panel, especially on this one as it's bulged out. Get those aside and get this tempered glass side panel off. Put it somewhere where it won't get scratched while you're not working on it. I guess, hey, you don't have to worry about it getting scratched so much. Smashed, more likely. Alright. What do we got here? Ooh, a PC speaker. I'm sure that'll come in handy. One fan in the back on this case. It's a 120 millimeter exhaust fan. It's got a Molex and a 3-pin header. Always pretty. You only use one or the other, so if your motherboard's got the 3-pin fan header to spare, you're probably going to want to use that. If not, you can just plug it directly in the power supply, but then it's going to run at full speed all the time. It's going to be louder. Basically, this is here just in case you need it. Okay, these are hilariously long cables for a like, you know, the cables are twice as long as the case is large, so I guess better than being too short, especially on a cheap case. Definitely better than them being too short. We've got a couple of 3.5-inch drive bays. Looks like there's a 2.5-inch spot there. Kind of has a 5.25-inch bay, but it's super ghetto. But it is there if you need it. One of the few cases left these days, especially cheaper cases, with tempered glass, and yet you still get a 5.25-inch bay. Of course, it's doing this typical thing on cheaper cases where we have 2 USB ports, but one's a USB 3, and one's a USB 2. Got headphone, microphone jack, power, and reset switch. At least the power switch, or at least the power button, is bigger than the reset button. I really hate it when cases have a power and a reset button side by side and they're the same size. Yeah, so that's your USB 3 header. And really? Well, that's interesting the way they did that. So you got your HD audio. This is the USB 2 port for the front. And then this is the USB 3 header. But it branches off to a second USB 2 header. So if your motherboard didn't have a USB 3 header, if it was an older motherboard, then you can use the 2 USB 2 headers, and at least the USB 3 port will work. Obviously only as a USB 2 port, but at least both ports would be working. I can't say I've ever seen that before. Typically on most cases, especially higher end cases, you're going to have two USB 3 ports. This one header is two USB 3 ports. So normally you would just plug this one header in and that would give you your two USB ports. But yeah, can't say I've ever seen that before. They're kind of just making sure that this case can work on a much older motherboard. Any motherboard in the last like 7 years, 8 years is going to have a USB 3 header on it. But all right, so usually I just lay the case down flat. Again, we don't have the side panel on either side, so we don't have to worry about scratching anything. It just makes it easier to put the motherboard in when it's in this orientation, and then we'll worry about all this. Alright, so I guess first thing we should do is install the rear I/O shield. This comes with the motherboard. Obviously, it is motherboard specific. And this just gets pushed in from the inside, and we'll just make sure you have it, I guess, right side up. That's all there is to that. As far as the standoffs go, let's grab the motherboard. So basically one of them's in the wrong spot. This one needs to move over a little bit. And two of them aren't there. So we need one here and here. The case hardware bag came with two extra standoffs. I've got this adapter on a screwdriver kit. I don't think it's 100% the right size, but it's close enough. Alright, I already moved that one, so that should be it. Motherboard should just drop in there now. It says you're dropping the motherboard in. Just take note of all the ports in the back. Make sure nothing is poking into any of the ports there. Looks good. Looks like all of our standoffs line up, so it's going to screw the motherboard in. From here on out, pretty much just going to need a standard Phillips screwdriver. The case hardware came with two different screws, a fine thread and a coarse thread. It's the fine thread that goes into these standoffs. Alright, so motherboard's installed. Got all the screws in, and everything on the back's lined up, and yeah, I guess I'm going to throw the power supply in next, but not all the modular cables. I'll just get the power supply screwed in. Alrighty, so this is the power supply. This is a semi-modular power supply, meaning some of the connections are modular. You can disconnect them. Some of them are hardwired. The 24-pin and the 8-pin CPU power connector are basically the ones that we're going to have to use, and so it doesn't really matter if you could disconnect those or not for the most part, unless you wanted to do custom cables or something. So semi-modular power supplies are usually fine. This just sits in the bottom like so. The hardware that came with the power supply, we got 4 screws. It's going to screw into the back. These are all the extra cables that came with the power supply. There's going to be some 4-pin Molex, some SATA power connectors, 6-pin PCI Express connectors. I actually don't think we're going to need to use any of these. I think we're just going to need the 24-pin and the 8-pin for the motherboard. We've got no SATA drives in here, and nothing that's going to need Molex, certainly. So, yeah, no video card that's going to need PCI Express power. So, yeah, I don't think we're going to need to use any of these. again, just hand tight. Gonna do a bit of a cross pattern on that. That's good. Alrighty, now to figure out what to do with all these cables. We'll deal with this one first. This is from the rear fan. Like I said, we are not going to use this. We're just going to use the 3-pin fan connector. On most motherboards, usually a header right around here because, they figure that's going to be pretty close to your rear fan. Go figure on this motherboard. They didn't give us one there. I see one here, and I see one up here somewhere, but I think actually that's going to be the closest one. I was going to put that on there, and then we'll figure out how to tighten this up. Maybe once we have the HD audio connectors, got to come back to here, and one of those USB 2 headers. So maybe once all that's in there, we'll figure out how to tie that up. Alrighty, so this is the HD audio. It's going to be near the back usually because that's your audio chip actually right there. And it's usually pretty close to the audio chip, not to mention the sound jacks are back there. This guy's keyed in a way just by one of the pins that's missing. Can kind of only go on one way. And that is the USB 2 header. Again, it's always missing, it's 9 pins, and it's missing one of the furthest pins. And again, any one of those headers there will do. And where the pin's missing is obvious on the header, on the cable, as to which way that will go. So now we got those and the fan cable all kind of close together. So like I said, they're going to get kind of tied together, and everything else is running out the back here. Now we still got to do the front panel, power switch, reset switch, power light, assuming there's a hard drive activity LED. Let's see. It's going to be these guys here. Yeah. So we got power switch, hard drive LED, reset switch, and so that should be power LED. Wait, did I already say power LED? Yeah. No, power switch. Okay, hard drive LED. Never mind. Power switch, reset switch, power LED, and hard drive LED. So we'll come through here. Those. And those are going to go right here. Typically that set of header pins for the front panel I/O is going to be up near the front of the motherboard. Alrighty, so that's these 4 here. The power switch and the reset switch, polarity doesn't matter. If you get the the 2 pins reversed, it doesn't matter. The LEDs though, it does matter. So the power light LED and the hard drive activity LED is typically going to be the positive on the very far left. So yeah, it's all silk screened on the motherboard, but it's very hard to see. And if you want to get a better look at that, it's usually in the motherboard manual. But yeah, if you've done that a few times, they're usually all the same. So especially on an off-the-shelf motherboard, you can get like an Acer pre-built or something, it's going to probably be different. But on a DIY motherboard, retail boxed motherboard, it's usually the same. So once you've done that a few times, you will be used to that. Alright, so we're going to come through here with the 24-pin connector. It's got to plug in here, and the USB 3 header is going to plug in here. These are kind of finicky. Doing that behind the camera. And then the 24-pin connector. Kind of bend it so it's gonna want to come off from the left here. Alright, so 24-pin connector and the USB 3 header. Again, that's got the weird little USB 2 tail hanging off of it. I guess I could zip tie that, but not a huge deal for now. And then from the back side here, the 8-pin, wow, that's a bad design. So on most cases, you'll be able to come up from the back side and get your 8-pin power connector. 8-pin power connector plugs in right on the other side of the motherboard, right here. And usually you can get up through there, back through here. So that's kind of cheesy, but again, this was a $35 case, so not a huge deal. We're going to have to end up, we'll just end up coming through here like we did with the 24-pin and run it across. Okay, so we'll come up and over as much as we can and plug that 8-pin in. We'll try and tie that up somewhere to keep it up out of the way. And that should be it. Not a whole lot of wires, extra wires back here. But yeah, I got some of the extra stuff tied up back there. And in there, that's what we're looking like. Yeah, that's it. It's done. Alright, so not much to see here. We got Windows 10. Gonna put that in the USB 3 slot there. And hit the power. Should boot off that and we can start installing Windows 10. Alright, so there's a Windows 10 installer. It sees the 500 gigabyte M.2 drive. So we're just going to install it on there. This should go relatively quickly on a system like this with M.2 drive installing Windows off of a USB 3 stick. So as you can see, that's going pretty quickly. So we'll come back when it's done. And it looks like the hard drive activity LED works. I like the way they did that. It's on the reset button. Reset button lights up red when the hard drive's running, and the power switch lights up white there. It actually works pretty good. Alright, Windows 10 is installed. It's really quick. I just let Windows Update get all the drivers. It installed the Intel Display Suite thingamabobber. And just gonna check a few things here. If we go to Task Manager and Performance, you can see that CPU we got. CPU we got 16 threads rocking away there. And for the RAM, we got 16 gigs of RAM, and it is running at 3200 megahertz. That is something that I had to go into the BIOS and set the XMP profile. It was defaulting to 2400 megahertz, which is very common. Typically on a motherboard, when you do a build and you just stick your RAM in and everything's set to auto, it's not going to load your RAM at full speed. It's usually going to load at like 2133 or maybe 2400 megahertz. But if your RAM's like 3000 or 3200, you're going to want to make sure you go in there, load the XMP profile. It's going to set the timings and the clock speeds and everything for your RAM. So yeah, that all looks good. It seems to be running pretty quickly. One thing I'm going to do is this is on my 4K TV. And as you can see there, resolution did default to 4K, which is great, except that when I bring this to the person's house it's being built for, their monitor is probably only going to be 1080p, so we might want to set that to 1080p now. And there we go. And yeah, I think that's it. It's running great. Nice and quiet. Got all the extra parts that came with in here. Again, we didn't use any of the modular power cables. All the extra cables are in there. The box for the CPU is in there. And I got all the stuff we didn't use for the motherboard in there. Some extra zip ties, some extra 2 SATA cables that came with. We didn't use any of them. And yeah, again, I did have to move the M.2. So during the build, I mentioned that typically you want to put your M.2 in the slot closest to the CPU, and that's true because your PCI Express controller is in your CPU, and your PCI Express controller, your M.2, is running on the PCI Express bus. This was a very rare instance where, because we're using a 500 series chipset motherboard, which supports 10th or 11th generation processors, we're using a 10th generation processor on this motherboard. Now, the 500 series chipsets came along because they support PCI Express 4.0. But a 10th generation processor does not support PCI Express 4.0. If you had an 11th generation processor on here, it would support PCI Express 4.0. That's pretty much irrelevant because our M.2 drive is only PCI Express 3.0 anyways. But what happens on these 500 series chipset motherboards, when you run a 10th generation processor in them, the first M.2 slot, or the M.2 slot closest to the CPU, basically doesn't work. And so you've got to use the one furthest from the CPU, which is just going to run off the chipset's PCI Express lanes. Yeah, but it's just a weird thing if you're using a 500 series chipset motherboard with a 10th generation CPU. Technically, the 400 series chipset motherboards were for the 10th gen, and then the 500 series were for the 11th gen, but they're cross-compatible. With a BIOS update, you can use an 11th gen chip on a 400 series. You won't get PCI Express 4.0. And you can use a 10th gen on a 500 series. So the socket didn't change. It's 1200. 12th generation, the socket changed again. 1700s, LGA 1700. But yeah, that was just the one thing that threw me off. The SSD wasn't showing up at first. And I actually remembered hearing people talking about 500 series chipsets with 10th gen CPUs and having that issue. So as soon as I moved the SSD into the other M.2 slot, it showed right up. So that's really the only thing that threw me for a bit of a loop. And even then, I realized it pretty quickly. So yeah, I got Windows 10 installed, and this thing's ready to go. All done.